mention in the previous episode when I was discussing a little bit of the history of the Gospel of Thomas that this text was discovered in 1945 as part of the Nag Hammadi find, the so-called Nag Hammadi library or Nag Hammadi codices. These were primarily Gnostic texts, a group of Christian Gnostic texts. And because it was found alongside of some Gnostic texts, it has long been considered a sort of Gnostic gospel. Although, as I stated previously, it was written before this movement of Christian Gnosticism, really. So it's sort of a pre-Gnostic text in that sense. And so the copy that was found in 1945 was essentially in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, was written in Coptic, ancient Coptic, okay, an ancient Egyptian language. But it had previously, we came to find out later, that people already possessed copies of the Gospel of Thomas in Greek, although they did not realize that these papyrus Greek writings were in fact part of the Gospel of Thomas, but there were three, I believe, separate papyri texts in Greek that scholars later determined were in fact the Gospel of Thomas. And those Greek papyri date back to, 130 AD or something like that. Extremely old. And the text itself was written long before that, probably around 40 AD, I believe, or possibly earlier than that even. But it comes from an even older oral tradition and probably written tradition known as the Q source or the Q material. And this was a group of Jesus's sayings that were written shortly after the time of Christ, possibly even during his lifetime. We don't know exactly when the so-called Q material was written. And there are really two periods or eras of Q material, or the Q source. One, the earliest era or period, was strictly sayings of Jesus, Jesus's mystical teachings. And then later on, there was a redaction of the Q material that included some information about judgment, the apocalypse, and all of these, or apocalyptic teachings rather, and judgment and the coming kingdom and all this. But the original Q material, the original Q source, was simply a collection of Jesus's actual teachings, things that Jesus actually taught. Now, if I'm a Christian, it seems to me that that would be the most important written material for my religious studies and for my religious purposes and for my belief structure and all that. However, much of modern day Christianity, well, really, dating back to, let's say, 250 AD, 300 AD, and onward, much of what Christians have practiced since then, or believed since then, is based primarily upon Paul's letters and Paul's teachings, and Paul's interpretation of Christ and Christ's life and Christ's teachings. And also, of course, the four so-called canonical Gospels, the three synoptic Gospels of Mark, Luke, and Matthew, and then John, which was written later. But those are the four so-called canonical Gospels. And a lot of what is included in those Gospels is based upon Paul's interpretation. And Those were written later than, and also they also contain a lot of the Q material as well. And there are a lot of similarities between the teachings that we find in the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels. They share a lot in common. However, what you'll find in the canonical Gospels, the original sayings or original teachings have been altered and exaggerated, and they've been fit into a narrative, fit into a sort of biography of Jesus and his life. And so they've been altered, changed, edited to fit into this narrative or story that's being told in the canonical Gospels. And these Gospels have a sort of Greco-Roman biographical format, you see. And so a lot was altered and edited and changed to fit into that format. And this, of course, led to a corruption of Jesus' original teachings and sayings, which can only be found really in their original state in the Gospel of Thomas. And again, I base a lot of my knowledge and research upon the book Ancient Christian Gospels by Helmust Koester. Okay, so I highly recommend reading that book. It's a very dense book. It's hard to get through. It is a highly academic, scholarly work. It's not reader-friendly. It's not very readable. But it is well worth reading if you can manage to get through it. And at any rate, we don't know exactly what the original Gospel of Thomas looked like as far as the Greek version. It's possible that there are also Aramaic versions. We don't know. A lot was added later on, and so the Coptic version that comes down to us certainly is not the original Gospel of Thomas. So it's hard to know exactly what Jesus' original teachings were, but the closest thing we have is what comes down to us in the Gospel of Thomas. So if I'm a Christian, my primary concern should be, what did Jesus actually teach? That should be the primary concern. Not what is Paul's interpretation of Jesus and his teachings based upon a vision that he supposedly had, or what other interpretations exist of Jesus' teachings. If I'm a Christian, a practicing Christian, my primary concern should be, what did Jesus actually teach? Not what do others believe about Jesus. Not what do others believe about Jesus' teachings and his life and his message. That is of secondary concern and import. As a Christian, one should be primarily concerned with what Jesus actually taught. Not what others believe about him, not what others believe he taught, not other people's interpretations of what he taught. What did he say? What did the man say? What did he teach? That's Christianity, you see. That is the only true Christianity, what Jesus actually taught and said. The rest is a corruption and an interpretation and oftentimes an interpolation of Jesus and his life and his teachings. And the closest thing we have, the purest source of Jesus' actual teachings, is in fact the Gospel of Thomas, based upon the original Q teachings. So the purest version of Jesus' actual words and teachings that we have is the Gospel of Thomas, what comes down to us in the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi. And, of course, the older Greek papyri, it's even better. It's a superior version with less editing and alteration and redaction. And so what we find in the Gospel of Thomas, in Jesus' actual teachings, is essentially non-dualism, enlightenment, teachings about the path to enlightenment and enlightenment itself, non-dual consciousness, spiritual divine union, samadhi, yoga, Advaita Vedanta. This is what Jesus taught. He was an awakened master. He woke up. It's possible that he was sort of born that way, an avatar, as it were. In the yoga tradition, we have this idea of the avatar. An avatar is an enlightened being who is essentially born enlightened. They're essentially enlightened from birth. Now we don't know for sure. It's possible that he was simply born fully awake. It's possible that he learned everything he needed to learn right where he was. A lot of these Essene communities, we think John the Baptist and Jesus were probably part of the Essenes, which was a Jewish sect that practiced a strict diet, mostly vegetarian diet, ritual bathing, ritual purification, meditation, prayer, celibacy. They lived out in the desert in small communities. And these were basically yogis. And there was a strong tradition of teachers. If you look at some of the other texts, so-called apocryphal texts that are not included in the Bible, they talk often about the teachers of righteousness, and all these things. And we know that prophets and teachers were extremely important in ancient Judaism. And so Jesus comes out of that tradition of teacher and disciple, and of these groups of monastics practicing their sadhana, their spiritual practices in the desert. Okay? And so, in other words, it wasn't necessary for him to go to India. He probably did, but even if he didn't, he had all that he needed there, really, to awaken fully to Christ consciousness, so-called. So Christ is an awakened master. He's an enlightened master. It's possible that he was born as an avatar, born fully awake. It's also possible that he, like most of us, was born a normal person and learned and grew and evolved and became enlightened later in life. Okay? Either way, he was enlightened. He was an enlightened master. And the teachings in the Gospel of Thomas represent that level of enlightenment. They represent Jesus' enlightenment. And there's no information in the Gospel of Thomas about his life. There's no biography, there's no narrative, there's no story, really. And that's because Jesus didn't really care if you knew about his personal life, his story, and his narrative, because he knew we are not our story. We are not our narrative. We are not this brief human life, this brief, temporary, fleeting, impermanent life-changing human experience that we're having here on this little rock. Okay? He wanted you to wake up as he had. So he taught us how to wake up. He taught the path to enlightenment as laid out in the Gospel of Thomas. The path of non-duality, the path of non-dual consciousness, complete spiritual awakening, complete liberation of consciousness. This is what Jesus taught. This is what was important for him to pass on these teachings, this transmission of enlightened consciousness. All enlightened masters do the same. So for them, their priority is transmitting enlightened consciousness to future generations. So he had disciples, and he wished to transmit his awakened consciousness to his disciples so that they could then become teachers in their own right and transmit this enlightened consciousness onto future generations. This is how lineages of masters operate. Okay? Any true enlightenment tradition has a lineage of enlightened masters. And the knowledge, the techniques of practice, teachings, and the transmission of enlightened energy and enlightened consciousness is passed from the teacher to disciples. Some of those disciples wake up, and those disciples have their own students. They become masters in their own right, and they have their own students. Some of those students wake up, and they have their own students, and it's an unbroken chain of this transmission of enlightened consciousness. And so he passed on what he had learned to Thomas, who I believe was his most enlightened disciple. And that's why he chose Thomas to give these mystical, esoteric teachings to. And then Thomas had them written down some years after Jesus' passing, probably, what he could remember. And that's what we find recorded in the original Greek papyri, and then later on in the Coptic version of the Gospel of Thomas. And so, unfortunately, most modern Christians don't practice Christianity. They don't follow Jesus' teachings. What they follow is a belief system based upon the salvationist interpretation of Jesus' life. So the difference between salvationist theology and Christian mysticism is in the salvationist theology of Paul and others, the belief is that Jesus died for our sins. He was sort of the great sacrificial lamb. And this symbolic death rids us of our sins. And if we believe that, if we have this belief, this electrical signal between neurons in the brain, we can go to heaven when the body dies. If we don't have this specific electrical signal flashing between neurons in the brain when we die, we burn in hell for all of eternity. So this is the salvationist theology. You can be a perfect human being, but if you're a Buddhist, you will burn in hell for all of eternity. You can be a wretched, terrible person, but as long as you have this specific belief in your brain, you will enter the gates of heaven. This is the salvationist theology. Now, Christian mysticism, or the original teachings of Jesus Christ, are enlightenment teachings, similar to the yoga teachings, the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, of the original Buddhist teachings. And the belief is that the soul continues to reincarnate in forms until one reaches a state of enlightenment And in so doing, one can ascend to more refined planes or dimensions of existence, and it is no longer necessary to continue the cycle of samsara or reincarnation into form. And so this is what Jesus taught. He did not teach salvationist theology. It's nowhere to be found in his teachings, even in the canonical Gospels. Even in the four canonical Gospels, Jesus never taught salvation theology. He never said that. This is Paul's interpretation and the interpretation of others that occurred later on. But Jesus himself never taught that. And so, even in the canonical Gospels, and especially in the Gospel of Thomas, he taught that we reincarnate into form over and over, basically until we wake up and we realize that we are divine, that we are pure consciousness, and that we are not the form. We are not the personality, we are not the mind, we're not the body, we're not our likes and dislikes, we're not our karma, we're not our attachments and aversions, we're not our ego, and that all these things are impermanent and changing and changeable, and that they have no fixed reality. It's an illusion. And that this world of material form is an illusion. And once we awaken from this dream, once we awaken from this illusion, and we experience our divine nature, and we live from that essence of being, what we truly are, we're awake, we're enlightened. And it is no longer necessary for us to continue reincarnating in form to continue learning these lessons. We can graduate, in other words, from this school. And this is called ascension. And then we can exist in the finer, more subtle dimensions or planes, the so-called astral planes or causal planes. And this is what Jesus taught. This is what all enlightened masters have taught for the last 10,000 years or more, if you believe in Atlantis and ancient civilizations that predate Göbekli Tepe and the oldest ruins that we have knowledge of. There's a lot of evidence to show that humanity is quite ancient, and that civilization is also quite ancient, far older than 10,000 years, but at any rate, at least for the last 10,000 years, this is what all Enlightenment traditions have taught. Jesus was no different. He was a part of these Enlightenment traditions. The path to enlightenment, the path to ascension. And so he ascended when he died, and now exists probably in a causal plane, a very refined causal plane, and continues to work from there. So this is what Jesus taught. He was an enlightened being. He was an enlightened master. And these enlightened teachings, esoteric, mystical teachings, are revealed in the Gospel of Thomas. He did not teach salvation theology in his original teachings. He never taught it, as a matter of fact, even in the canonical Gospels. These are Paul's corruptions. Paul co-opted Christianity for his own selfish purposes and reasons. He was a bit of an egomaniac, sort of a cult leader of his day. Okay? And so I'll read now the first 3 verses of the Gospel of Thomas and give my interpretation and commentary. So the introduction to the Gospel of Thomas says, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." Okay? So this is a title given to Thomas. It basically just means twin. My interpretation of that, and not just mine, other people's, is that Thomas was Jesus' spiritual twin because he was his highest disciple, and so he also had attained this Christ consciousness that Christ had uncovered or unveiled in himself. And so Thomas was essentially Jesus's twin, and that he would become a master afterward and have his own students and pass on these Enlightenment teachings and continue the lineage of enlightenment. Okay? And notice it says secret sayings. This is not necessarily what Jesus taught to the public in his public speeches and sermons, like the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Those teachings were more for the masses, but then Jesus had more private teachings for his highest disciples like Thomas. And so these are the highest teachings of Jesus that come down to us from great antiquity. So these weren't really for everyone, and Jesus knew that. He had two groups of teachings, quantity and quality. The quantity was for the masses, who did not possess the intellectual and spiritual capacities to understand his highest teachings. But he gave the quality teachings to a select few. Most gurus, most masters do this. They do the same. Okay? Verse 1. And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. So this is what I was just talking about with the ascension process. When every time that we reincarnate, we forget. We forget what we are as spirit, as units of pure consciousness, divine units. And we forget each time, and we reincarnate into another form, and we become identified with that form for some years or decades, and we die, and the cycle continues until we wake up from the dream. However, when we wake up, we don't experience death. We don't forget each time. And we don't have to continue to reincarnate. We create a new body, so to say, an astral body. We all have astral bodies, okay? And the astral body continues when the physical body dies, but the astral body reincarnates into another form, and it forgets every time what it is. And it becomes identified with a new form each time. This is Maya, or illusion. This is the cycle, samsara, the cycle of reincarnation. However, it's possible to transcend this cycle, to overcome this cycle of rebirth and death, so that once we're awakened, when the physical body dies, we don't quote-unquote experience death because we don't forget what we are. We're awake. So we can continue onto astral planes knowing what we are. And we don't have to continually be reborn, live a brief life, die, be reborn, live a brief life, die, over and over again. So we don't experience death. We don't forget anymore. We know what we are, and we continue living in the ascended planes, in the astral planes and causal planes. Okay? Verse 2, Jesus said, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. This is the spiritual path, seeking. We are all seekers. We are spiritual seekers on the spiritual path. When he finds, he will become troubled. Okay, this is what happens when we come on to the spiritual path and we realize for the first time that we aren't who we thought we were. It's very shocking. It can be quite troubling. It can lead to a dark night of the soul. It can lead to depression. And certainly it was a shock for me, and it is for most seekers, when I realized that I wasn't Chris, this character that I had been identified with my entire life. It was quite shocking. and troubling. And my ego resisted. It still resists this fact. Even today, after a couple decades of meditation, spiritual practice, and all of that, it's a daily battle. That's why in the Bhagavad Gita, uh, Krishna's conversation with Arjuna, the awakened consciousness speaking to the seeker. Yeah, Krishna basically describes this allegory of a war. He describes the spiritual path as a war between the soul and the ego. It's like that. It's like that. And the ego constantly resists, it constantly rebels, because the identification is so strong with form. And the identification is so strong with ego. And so it resists. And so when we realize for the first time that we're not who we thought we were, it's a shock to the system. And the ego doesn't like it, and it resists it, and it rebels, and it constantly finds ways to continue its rebellion, to prolong its rebellion. And it's a battle. It's a battle between the soul and the ego. The ego is like a fascist dictator that wants to maintain its control at any cost. And so it views meditation, it views the spiritual path, it views the spiritual teacher, all of these things as threats to its dominance, threats to its authoritarian control over your life and your being. And so, yes, we become troubled. When we first wake up, it's troubling and can be shocking and sort of depressing to realize that our entire life has been a lie, that we were living in a dream state, sleepwalking through life on autopilot, asleep, living an illusion, living a lie, believing that we were something that we aren't. And in my personal case, yeah, it was very shocking and quite troubling at first. But eventually, this knowledge, this wisdom liberates us. So in the beginning, it's troubling. In the end, it's liberating to realize that we are not who we thought we were. Thank God I'm not Chris. My God. I mean, this little limited character, this tiny limited actor. Thank goodness. And so it becomes liberating, but at first it's troubling. It's a shock to the system to find out that you've been living a lie your entire life, and that this is all a dream, all an illusion, and that you were asleep this whole time. It's quite troubling, quite shocking, but eventually it's liberating because we know what we are as units of pure, divine, loving, peaceful, tranquil consciousness. This is our true nature. And we awaken from the dream, and it liberates us. So he says, when he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished. So when we wake up, it's astonishing to find out that we are much larger, much deeper than we thought. It's astonishing. You can have these mystical experiences where you experience yourself as the entire universe. I've had such experiences. Cosmic consciousness. It's astonishing to realize that we are essentially everything. And we exist everywhere. We are everything. We are not these tiny little limited creatures. It's astonishing. He says, when he becomes troubled, he will be astonished and he will rule over the all. So when we wake up, when we have these experiences of samadhi, oneness consciousness, divine union, cosmic consciousness, we rule over the all. In other words, we become all. And we're free. We're free beings. We're no longer reacting compulsively to life and the situations that arise in our lives. We are no longer reactive beings, controlled, enslaved by circumstances. We live freely. We're liberated. We are in control. We are no longer controlled. So we rule over the all instead of being ruled. When we live from our limited egoic consciousness, we are ruled by life. And we're constantly reacting and creating attachments and aversions, and we suffer. Yeah, but when we're liberated, when we're free, we no longer react. We simply observe. We exist as the observer, pure consciousness. And we're free. And we rule. We are in control. We are no longer controlled by ego, by maya, by samsara. Okay? In verse 3, this is the last verse I'll read in this episode. Jesus said, if those who lead you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. Non-dualism, okay? When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known. And you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. So in other words, heaven isn't necessarily a place that will come in the future. And it is not necessarily another dimension that we go to when we die. Although you can ascend to these higher planes of existence. But heaven is always here. We always have access to peace and tranquility and love and light because we are that, you see. You always have access to perfect peace and love and light and tranquility because you are that. Your essence is that. This pure consciousness that you are is always tranquil, always peaceful, always loving, always objective, always clear, perfectly content. So we always have access to the kingdom. There's no need to wait until the body dies to experience the kingdom. We always have access to the kingdom. It's always here with us. Always. This fact will never change. The problem is that we identify with the superficial vibrations occurring on the superficial layers of our being. And therefore we suffer because we're identified with something that we aren't really. But the kingdom is within us, outside of us. It's everywhere, always, and we always have access to it. He says, but if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. So if you're not awake, you don't live in the kingdom. You're identified with form. You're identified with ego. You're identified with mind. You're identified with emotions and desires and attachments and aversions. And you suffer. You live in poverty, spiritual poverty. He says you are that poverty when you're not awake. Once you realize that the kingdom is always available, always accessible, and that you always are that, you no longer live in poverty. You no longer dwell in poverty. Everything has to do with identification. What are you identified with? When you wake up from the dream, you no longer identify with temporary changing phenomena, vibratory phenomena. You realize that you are that which does not vibrate, that which does not change, that which is permanent, infinite. And this knowledge is liberating. This knowledge frees us.